So it was just shy of 30 years ago when an 8-year-old version of myself was sitting in the school cafeteria with a friend of mine, and I asked him a very blunt, very straightforward question. I asked him, "Are you a Christian?" Right? I hadn't yet learned the art of easing into conversations around God and religion and those sorts of things, but I genuinely wanted to know the answer to the question. And even though I wouldn't end the friendship with him, I knew that what he believed about God was a factor, and so I wanted to know what he believed. And I wanted to know what I was going to be dealing with, right? So he said, yeah, he's like, my family, they go to church on Sundays, I go to youth group, and he proceeded to list off all the things that many people in our culture would associate with following Jesus, right? And our friendship continued, it developed, and at one point, he actually made a public declaration of faith in Jesus, and our conversations around God and what it meant to follow Jesus continued well into our adulthood. He ended up passing away in November of 2020. But if I could characterize my friend's relationship with Jesus, if I could describe it in one word to you, it would be distant, right? And that's not to disparage him. That would be from his own self-admission if he were to talk to you. Now, he never abandoned his faith. He never said, I'm done with Jesus. But the sort of life that you look at, and it's noticeably different from the rest of the world, the sort of life that exudes what the Apostle Paul talks about when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, like love and joy and peace, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. Those were some of the things that he struggled with, and they were never manifested in his life. He made some progress along the way, but he never got there. He struggled to follow Jesus closely. He was a great guy. He was one of the most personable and intelligent and funny people I had the privilege of knowing. But it was always a struggle to follow Jesus closely in his life. And his story is not an isolated one. There's a 2021 study that was done by George Barna and the Cultural Research Center to determine the worldview of self-proclaimed Christians. And what I mean by worldview, by the way, in case you're curious, it's your decision-making filter. So every single one of us has an intellectual and an emotional and a spiritual filter that we use that guides our choices, guides our decision-making. Now, there's a ton of stuff in this research, and I'm not going to bore you with all the numbers, but I'll just give you a few key ones. There are 176 million Americans that claim to be Christian. And if you're a math person, which I am not, that is 69% of the total population. Close to 70% of our country are self-proclaimed Christians. Now, at its face, that might sound like a really, really good number. Sounds really encouraging. But when you parse out the details and the questions they ask in this study, it gets slightly less encouraging. Actually, a lot less encouraging. Only 9% of those people, based on the questions that were asked, actually hold a biblical worldview. Only 9%. 9% of people who are self-proclaimed Christians hold to the teaching and the example of Jesus Christ as clearly laid out in the Scriptures. And so I'm not going to give you all the details surrounding that. If you want to look it up, you can Google it. But I want to share with you what George Barna, the guy that conducted this study, said of the findings. He said this: too often, people who want a certain reputation or image embrace the label Christian, regardless of their spiritual life and intentions. Christian has become somewhat of a generic term rather than a name that reflects a deep commitment to passionately pursuing and being like Jesus Christ. So according to this study, there is a mass amount of people who identify as followers of Jesus who only use the label Christian for their own personal gain. And they follow Jesus from a distance, and that's assuming they follow Jesus at all. So Christianity has become this convenient badge of honor that many people wear, but the authentic worldview of a follower of Jesus, which flows out of the lifestyle of a follower of Jesus, has been and continues to be in pretty short supply these days. And maybe you were listening to my story about my friend and you're hearing about this study and you're thinking, yeah, that's my mom, or that's my dad, that's my brother, that's my spouse. But the truth is, distance from Jesus has always been, at one point or another, let me rephrase that, has been at some point in our life a part of our story. Distance from Jesus has been at some point in our life a part of our story. Because there is a difference between being altogether disconnected from Christ and being distant from Christ. If you don't know Jesus, you are disconnected from life that is found in God only in Jesus. But maybe you've made an honest and sincere profession of faith. You said, Jesus, I am going to follow you and your ways and what you want for my life with everything that I have. Maybe you've honestly said that at one point in your life. But if you're honest, you're like, you know what? I'm not as close as I would like. I'm not following Jesus closely. I'm not following Jesus intimately. And there's this gap between you and Christ that you've allowed maybe a relationship or busyness or leisure activities or success or money or name it. It's created a gap between you and Christ. So we can say with confidence that we follow Jesus. And at the same time, there could be a bit of distance between us and Jesus. And so as we get started this morning, if you're just being honest with yourself, is that you? And can you identify what or who is occupying that space that exists between you and Jesus? And I say that not to heap judgment or condemnation or guilt. I say that as a sincere invitation to draw closer to him today, and to do what you need to do today to draw closer to him. Now, in the story that we're going to be looking at in the Gospel of Mark, there's a character here that we'll look at who at one point in his life said, I'm going to leave everything in my life. I'm going to leave my old life behind, and I'm going to follow Jesus. And we're going to look at this story where he is technically following Jesus. Jesus is going in a particular direction, and this person is going in this same direction. But we find that this person is following Jesus at a distance. So we're going to be in Mark 14, starting in verse 53. Now, last week, we ended with the account of Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss, and this mysterious man running off into the darkness totally naked. Still not totally sure what that's about, but that's in there. But we also found all of the disciples, not just Judas, abandoning Jesus in his hour of need. And so Jesus is alone. He's left with his captors, being taken away, and this is where we find ourselves in Mark chapter 14, verse 53. It reads, and they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. So Jesus is being held captive. He's being led to the home of the high priest, a guy by the name of Caiaphas. So all the chief priests were there, the scribes, this ruling body of the Jewish people known as the Sanhedrin are there. Now it's worth noting here that Jesus was not taken to the customary meeting place for a trial. Okay? Instead, he was taken to the home of the high priest. This does not happen. This is the only time in Jewish history where this has ever taken place. And this is the only time when a trial was conducted at night, which is illegal in the Jewish law. So the trial, as you would imagine, is not looking favorable towards Jesus, right? Not looking good. And as this trial starts to unfold, Mark turns his attention to one of Jesus' disciples, to Peter. It reads, "And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire." So Peter follows Jesus at a distance. Now, unless someone is ill, the only reason why you would keep a distance from said person is if you did not want to be associated with them. Parents of teenagers, you likely know this well, okay? So Peter is keeping a safe distance from him and Jesus, doesn't want to be associated with Jesus, wants to do what he can to avoid people seeing him with Jesus, and he's warming himself by the fire. So what Peter is doing here, two key things. He's prioritizing his safety and his comfort. He's prioritizing his safety and his comfort over his fidelity to his Savior, to Jesus. So we'll come back to this story in a moment, but Mark, after putting our attention on Peter, brings it right back to this trial. Listen to what it says. "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.'" Jesus never said that. "Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree." So we'll stop there for a moment. Now, if you're following the text carefully, perhaps you're picking up on the fact that this ruling body presiding over this trial of Jesus is not exactly on a truth-finding mission, right? They're not seeking the truth. They're intentionally looking for dirt on Jesus. They're looking for something that would incriminate Jesus and would give them enough evidence to put him to death. This is what we might like to call a witch hunt. Now, we said before, Jewish law says that a trial had to take place during the day. It couldn't take place at night. So they're doing this under the cover of darkness. And they couldn't do a trial during Sabbath or a feast day or the day before either. And I'm telling you all the laws that they're breaking here, okay? And the Jewish law also required that in a capital case, 2 eyewitnesses had to agree on their testimony. And however, in this case, none of those things were followed. All of them were violated. The trial was held at night, false witnesses were produced, and testimony did not agree. Okay? So this is the Sanhedrin. This is the ruling body of the Jewish people that was meant to protect and uphold the Jewish law. Similar to how our Supreme Court is designed to protect our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. So they're not doing that. And in addition to that, they are breaking the 10 Commandments. They're bearing false witness. They're literally producing false witnesses, people that are lying about Jesus and what he said. Now, if I can get a little bit nerdy with you for a moment, okay? This is important. The Greek word for witness is the word martyria. It's where we get the word martyr from. Have you ever heard the phrase, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church? Right, that's where this whole concept and idea comes from. Because martyrs would give their best testimony for Jesus Christ before they would quite literally give their lives for Jesus Christ. So martyr is quite literally one who gives testimony. But there is another word in this text, pseudo-martyria. And you could imagine what that means. It means false or counterfeit witness. And that's what happens in this hearing. Many bore false witness against him. Okay? Their testimonies conflicted. And in verse 60, it reads, "And the high priest stood up in their midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?'" So just picture this story unfolding for a moment. You can imagine the agitation and the frustration in Caiaphas' voice. "Jesus, these people are making all of these accusations against you. What do you have to say for yourself? Speak up." He kept silent. He said nothing. Fulfilling the prophecy laid out in Isaiah 53, like a lamb who was led before the slaughter, he opened not his mouth. But furthermore, I think Jesus knew the motive of the people conducting the trial. He knew no matter what he said, no matter how accurate it was, no matter how sincere it was, no matter how truthful it was, they would twist, they would distort, they would misconstrue his words to be used against him. Better to let these false witnesses say what they were going to say and not open his mouth. Stay quiet. So at this point, Caiaphas is just beside himself. "Jesus, say something." And he asked him, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of the Blessed?" Now, the blessed is this word that the Jewish people used to protect themselves from saying the name of God so that they did not misuse the name of God. Right? They were very strict on this. So when he's asking, "Are you the Son of the Blessed?" he's asking, "Are you the Son of God?" And here's Jesus' reply. And Jesus said, this is the first time Jesus opens his mouth, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." So Jesus answers yes. Now there's two questions that Caiaphas is asking here. Now I know we're going into the weeds a little bit. I'm going to bring this all together. Trust me. Okay. So there's two questions that Caiaphas is asking here. He's asking, "Are you the Messiah? And are you the Son of God?" Two separate things. Now, it was not a capital offense to proclaim that you are the Messiah. Now, that could lead to other charges like lying and causing disorder, those types of things. But when Caiaphas was asking Jesus, "Are you the Son of God?" he is getting right to the heart of the matter. Are you the Son of God? And what Jesus does is he responds by quoting from the Old Testament, from Daniel chapter 7, which Caiaphas would have been familiar with. He says, "Yes, I am the Son of God. I am the Son of Man, and I am going to come on the clouds of heaven, and I'm going to judge heaven, I'm going to judge earth." And so, in a sense, what Jesus is saying here to Caiaphas is, this is not the last time that we're going to meet in the context of a trial. I am going to come back someday, and you're going to be judged by me. And so, here's what Caiaphas does. And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving of death. Right now in the Old Testament, when somebody ripped their garments, it meant one of two things. It either meant you were overcome with deep grief and sorrow or deep rage and anger. Want to take a guess which one this is? Yeah. Caiaphas is absolutely furious here. He says, "Have you heard this blasphemy? What more do we need?" And so they all condemn him. They all condemn him to death. And now, Jesus does not commit blasphemy here. He doesn't. Blasphemy is what happens when you use God's name improperly, and when it's done in an attitude of disrespect or disregard for God's name. right? It's using God's name as a curse or just using it as a casual way instead of treating it with the proper reverence that it rightly deserves. But Jesus doesn't blaspheme God's name. He blesses God's name. But they considered it blasphemous that Jesus would identify himself as the Son of God. But it's a charge without any sort of legal basis, and yet they condemn him. And continuing on, it reads, "And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophesy.' And the guards received him with blows." So Jesus is beaten, he's spit on, he's punched, he takes it. Now, as all of this is unfolding, as all of this is happening to Jesus, Mark turns our attention back over to who we were introduced to just a moment ago. It's Peter. And we saw how Jesus responded in this trial against him. And now let's see how Peter responds in the moment that he is in. Let's see. "And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, 'You also were with the Nazarene Jesus.' But he denied it, saying, 'I neither know nor understand what you mean.' And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, 'This man is one of them.'" So there's this trial that is unfolding upstairs in the high priest's home against Jesus. And there's another sort of lesser trial that is taking place in the courtyard. But this trial, this sort of questioning, does not come from somebody who has authority. It doesn't come from the Sanhedrin. It comes from a servant girl, someone who has no power, who has no authority, who has no societal status whatsoever. And when she questions Peter, when she begins to interrogate him, he denies knowing Jesus. And then Peter proceeds to go out further away from Jesus. He goes out into the gateway or to the porch for further safety, and then the rooster crows. And then the servant girl begins to ask the people around her, isn't this the guy? Like, this is one of them. Look at him. I know this is one of Jesus' disciples. And then it reads, "But again, he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, 'Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean.' But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know this man of whom you speak.'" So Peter denies knowing Jesus. Remember, this is a man that was one of Jesus' 3 closest followers among the 12, one of his best friends. He denies knowing Jesus 3 times. And he punctuates this third denial of Christ with a curse. And now this could mean one of 2 things or a combination of these 2 things. It could mean that Peter is just using foul language in this moment. He's like, "I don't know the blank guy, right? Leave me alone." Or it could mean that Peter is actually invoking the name of God as a curse. Okay? One of those 2 things, or maybe both, were taking place here. But it says in verse 72, "And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, 'Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.' And he broke down and wept." What I find interesting is that while Jesus was convicted as guilty of blasphemy, the one who was likely guilty of blasphemy was in the courtyard. And then Peter, in this moment, it says he thinks about it. He considers it. He reflects on what he just did. And then he broke down. He wept. So you know how you don't feel the force of guilt when you have people around you? That you don't really feel the full weight of that until you're by yourself and your head hits the pillow at night, right? Like all the walls that you put up, all the defensive gestures that you put up when you're around people, they come down when you're in private. It's just you and God, and you feel the full weight of what you did. That's Peter in this moment, okay? But here's the thing. Peter didn't go straight to denying Jesus, right? He didn't. His journey was a progressive one, right? Earlier in this chapter, we read about Peter chopping off the ear of the guard of the high priest. That's how gung-ho he is about protecting his rabbi, his master. What happened? Because then, what do we find at the beginning of this passage we just read? He was warming himself at the fire with the guards. That's a little bit awkward, right? I think. So what happened? Peter followed Jesus at a distance. And eventually, Peter's distance from Jesus led to an outright denial of Jesus. And listen, I believe that there is a very real spiritual burden, a weight that rests on us when we attempt to follow Jesus from a distance. Instead of pursuing him with everything that we have, instead of pursuing closeness and intimacy with him. There's a cognitive dissonance that takes place within us when we have this gap between what we say we believe and what we do in critical moments. See, Peter never stopped being a disciple of Jesus, but he denied being a disciple of Jesus. This is the same Peter who said, I will die before I deny. Jesus, I will die for you before I deny following you. Jesus says to him, no, you won't. You will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice. And that's what he did. Right? And that's what many people do, right? We follow Jesus at a distance. We follow Jesus in a way that is safe and is comfortable. And I think what we find in this passage is that the more distant we are from Jesus, the less and less we look like Jesus. That's not a profound statement, right? It's true, but it's the simplest of truths that I think we forget. The more distant we are from Jesus, the less we look like Jesus. And I think if we hold up the life of Peter, what he's doing in this moment, and contrast it with the life of Jesus unfolding in the very same moment, we find this to be true. Right? Look at what Jesus does in his trial, and look at what Peter is doing in his. I'll put it right up for you on the screen. Jesus abandons safety and comfort. Peter pursues safety and comfort. Jesus is silent when falsehoods are spoken about him. Peter speaks falsehoods when truth is spoken about him. Jesus blesses the name of God. Peter blasphemes the name of God. Jesus declares his identity as the Son of God, and Peter denies his identity as a disciple of Jesus. Do you see it? The more distant we are from Jesus, the less we look like Jesus. So when a moment of truth arrives, when it is in front of you, where you have to show not just by your words but also by your actions that you are a follower of Jesus before anything or everything else, what will you do? What will you say? And does the fruit of your life show that you are walking in closeness with Jesus? Or does it reveal perhaps that you've been distant from him? And my urging to you today is don't let another day go by where you are at the same distance from Jesus Christ that you are today. What do you need to do today to draw closer to him? Okay? You see, as your pastor, I can't do any of those things for you. I can exhort and I can urge, I can encourage you to take those necessary steps. I can't make them for you, though. What are you doing to draw closer to Jesus, and what will you do? Right? Now, for some of you, it's going to mean something simple. It's going to mean, all right, I've been distant from Jesus because, I just haven't prioritized, opening up my Bible and just meditating on the words of God and letting him speak to me through it. Or maybe you're like, I haven't prayed in weeks. I need to start praying. I need to start bringing my requests before God again, and I need to start inviting the Holy Spirit to speak to me. Or maybe it's like, I need to actually build in margin into my schedule and have a day of rest. I haven't been following God and his word in that regard. Or for you, it might require something a bit more radical. It might mean a lifestyle change. Maybe in this time, God's been revealing a habitual sin that you've been engaging in, and you're like, I know that thing that I've been doing isn't right, but I've been doing it anyway, and I need to stop. I need to throw that thing off, to be done with it and live the life that I know Jesus is calling me to do. Because the truth is, the more distant we are from Jesus, the less and less we look like Jesus. And the opposite is also true, right? The closer we are to Jesus, the more we look like Jesus. So what do you need to do to draw closer to Jesus than you are right now, today? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I think it's human nature for us to follow you like Peter did, at a distance. Because we like comfort. We like safety. We don't like the discomfort that comes with being a disciple of you. But Lord, forgive us for the ways that we've pursued our safety and comfort more than we pursued our faithfulness to you. And yes, we don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like to feel unsafe. But Lord, you bring us into moments that will reveal how much we trust you, how much we have faith in you and take you at your word. And Lord, in those critical moments, would you give us courage? Would you give us boldness to not deny you, but to faithfully proclaim you and to live for you? But God, we can't do that without your Spirit. So Lord, fill us with your Spirit today. Empower us by your grace. May we trust that the closer we move towards you, the more we will look like you. And I love what your word says, that when we draw near to you, you draw near to us. And we don't have to take these big, giant leaps towards you. We just need to take a step of faithfulness to you, a step of obedience towards you, whatever that might look like for us. And you and your love and your grace and your kindness and your mercy, you meet us the rest of the way. And we have the joy and the peace of knowing you when we do. So Lord, be with us today as we pursue you, as we seek to follow you as closely as we can. In your name I pray. Amen. Amen. So we're going to do something a little bit different.